The story of Napoleon Bonaparte, one of historical past's most enigmatic figures, starts unveiled, not in the grand palaces of France, nor upon the blood-soaked battlefields of Europe, but on a small Mediterranean island, Corsica. It used to be here, in the windswept coastal town of Ajaccio, that Napoleon used to be born into a world teetering between historical feudal hierarchies and the stirring calls for liberty and revolution. His beginnings have been humble, his family minor nobles of modest approach, yet within the boy burned an ambition so fierce, so relentless, that it would in the future reshape the very map of Europe. A new child in a turbulent land, Napoleon Bonaparte was once born on August 15, 1769. Best months after Corsica had been formally ceded to France by using the Republic of Genoa. The island, lengthy, embattled, and happy with its independence, used to be in the course of cultural upheaval. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was once a Corsican noble and attorney who originally supported the island's independence action led by Pasquale Paoli, a countrywide hero and staunch opponent of French annexation. Nonetheless, sensing the altering tides of energy, Carlo eventually pledged allegiance to France, making certain that his youngsters would develop up in a land underneath French rule, an allegiance that may be crucial to Napoleon's future. The Bonapartes weren't wealthy, but they held repute as minor nobility. This repute granted Napoleon entry into elite French associations, a privilege that would expose him to Enlightenment ideas, military method, and eventually, the opportunity to upward push by means of the ranks of a society present process, radical transformation. From Corsican outsider to French cadet, Napoleon's early years had been marked by means of cultural dislocation. Although French was once the language of his education, Corsican was once the language of his dwelling. Actually, he didn't communicate French fluently unless good into his teenage years, and he spoke it with a heavy Corsican accent for the rest of his life, a factor of mockery among his friends in later years. This dual identity, Corsican via heart, French with the aid of necessity, would deeply have an effect on his political and individual motivations. At the age of 9, Napoleon was sent to mainland France to attend the Navy Institution of Brienne, one of the most top academies for the sons of French aristocrats. There, the young Corsican was once mocked for his accent, provincial manners, and outsider popularity. These youth had been complicated, stuffed with isolation and resentment. Nonetheless, in addition, they served to forge in him a quiet resolution and an obsession with personal benefit. It was at Brienne that Napoleon commenced to domesticate the qualities that would outline his management: rigorous discipline, a close photographic memory, and a voracious appetite for historical past and procedure. The making of a soldier. Upon graduating from Brienne, Napoleon received admission to the celebrated École Militaire in Paris. He was once handist, 15 years historic when he entered, but he accomplished the 2-year application in a single 12 months, graduating in 1785 on the age of 16. Proficient in artillery, Napoleon joined the French army as a second lieutenant. The French Navy within the late 1780s was deeply hierarchical, riddled with aristocratic privilege, and generally stagnant. Officers have been drawn from noble households, and development used to be extra about pedigree than efficiency. For a law-rating Corsican noble like Napoleon, there was once little hope of rapid promotion. However, as fate would have it, revolution was brewing, one that will tear aside the old order and create opportunities for men of ambition and skill. Corsican goals and disillusionment. Napoleon had begun to search out his position in the French army. He remained deeply related to Corsica and its battle for autonomy. He again in general to the island in the early years of his navy profession and attempted to align himself with Pasquale Paoli, who had returned from exile to lead the Corsican resistance. Napoleon's initial admiration for Paoli, however, changed into frustration and clash. Paoli seen the younger officer as too professional French and distrusted his ambitions. Through 1793, the cut-up had grown to be irreparable. Paoli accused the Bonapartes of treason, and Napoleon's household was compelled to flee Corsica for mainland France. It was once a moment of deep private betrayal for Napoleon, but additionally a turning point. Exiled from the land of his beginning, he forged his lot utterly with the French Revolution. His identification as a Corsican patriot paled. In its situation emerged the ambitious French officer who would soon trade the destiny of a continent. Revolution opens doors. The revolution that erupted in 1789 turned France the wrong way up. The monarchy crumbled, and with it the inflexible structures of aristocratic privilege. In the chaos of innovative France, the navy became one of the most few institutions that placed talent and loyalty to the new republic could still be rewarded. For Napoleon, this used to be the second he had been waiting for. He commenced to distinguish himself within the early 1790s through a series of writings and minor assignments, exhibiting each army acumen and political savvy. His step forward came in 1793 for the period of the Siege of Toulon. The port city had been seized by way of royalist forces and their British allies, threatening the revolution's southern flank. Napoleon, then most effective 24 years, historic, was once given the chance to command artillery in the siege. It used to be here that he demonstrated, now not best his tactical brilliance, repositioning cannons and launching victorious assaults, but additionally his daring. His plan to grab strategic hills overlooking the city ended in a decisive victory. The British were pushed out, and the Republic reclaimed Toulon. Napoleon used to be promoted to brigadier general, and grew to be a rising famous person in revolutionary France. The shadow of the guillotine. However, progressive France used to be a treacherous situation. The equal ideals that propelled young officers like Napoleon upward also sent 1000s to the guillotine. The Reign of Terror, orchestrated via Robespierre and the Jacobins, gripped Paris in a frenzy of paranoia. Napoleon, ever the pragmatist, stored his head down and his allegiances bendy. When Robespierre fell in 1794, Napoleon was briefly arrested as a result of his association with the Jacobin regime. His political fortunes had shifted once more, but simplest briefly. It might now not be long before possibility got here knocking another time, and this time it could be Paris itself that wanted saving. The whiff of grapeshot in October 1795. A royalist rebellion threatened the newly situated listing, the reasonable executive that replaced the radical Jacobin. Paris was underneath siege from inside, and the federal government, determined and disorganized, grew to become to a young basic who had established himself in Toulon, Napoleon Bonaparte, given command of the town's defenses. Napoleon acted with attribute decisiveness. He ordered cannons to be placed alongside key streets, and famously used grapeshot clusters of small iron balls to mow down the advancing insurgents. The brutal, however strong, suppression of the uprising earned him the gratitude of the listing, and the admiration of many. Napoleon was once now the savior of the Republic. His identifier was once recognized across France. Inside months, he would receive command of the Navy of Italy, and his legend would truly. As the wintry weather of 1796 thawed into spring, the winds of struggle carried a younger common towards fate. Napoleon Bonaparte, barely 26 years, historic, had simply been appointed commander-in-chief of the French Navy of Italy. To many in Paris, this gave the look of a final-minute appointment, possibly even a favor from political allies. The Italian front had long been regarded secondary, a distraction from the greater battles against the Austrians and the Prussians in different places. The military of Italy used to be poorly equipped, malnourished, and demoralized, but for Napoleon, it was once the ultimate crucible in which to forge his legend. This chapter traces the magnificent 1796 to 1797 Italian campaign, where Napoleon now not simply beaten multiple Austrian armies and reorganized the Italian peninsula, but in addition transformed himself from a provincial common into a national hero and, more ominously, a man increasingly aware of his possessed capability to form historical past with the stroke of a pen or the swing of a sword. France's struggle, Europe, a global in flames too. Understand the importance of the Italian campaign. We ought to first step again and examine the geopolitical chaos that defined Europe in the 1790s. Following the French Revolution, France had declared battle on close to all of its neighbors, who feared the unfold of revolutionary beliefs to their possessed monarchies. The primary coalition and alliance, composed of Britain, Austria, Prussia, Spain, and others, sought to include or crush innovative France. For France, the battle was existential. Internally divided and economically strained, the nation desperately needed military victories to stabilize its unstable political panorama. On this context, generals were not mere officers, they were national saviors or political threats. Success on the battlefield translated into energy in Paris. The Italian front used to be intended to distract Austria, France's most robust enemy, and to force it to commit resources away from the Rhine. But regardless of a couple of campaigns, the French had been largely unsuccessful in Italy. The terrain was harsh, the army used to be underfed, and commanders did not keep self-discipline or morale. Enter Napoleon Bonaparte, the appointment. A calculated hazard in March 1796. Napoleon received orders from the listing in Paris appointing him to guide the navy of Italy. His choice used to be no longer in basic terms because of military skill. He had built powerful relationships with political figures like Paul Barras, probably the most strong members of the Directory. More importantly, he had just married Josephine de Beauharnais, the widowed lover of Barras, and a girl with tremendous political connections. Some within the French army and political circles saw this appointment as a patronage reward for a promising but untested young officer. Napoleon, nevertheless, had his possess ideas. He right away set to work remodeling the navy of Italy. When he arrived, he discovered an army of 30,000 hungry, unpaid, and bitter men. Supplies were scarce, discipline had collapsed, and morale used to be non-existent. Napoleon did not start with methods. He commenced with phrases, words as weapons, the power of propaganda. Upon arriving in excellent, Napoleon delivered an tackle to his troops. Squaddies, you are naked and unwell fed. The government owes you much, however can give you nothing. Your patience, your courage, do you honor, but they carry you no glory. I'm about to lead you into the most fertile plains on the earth. Rich provinces, exceptional cities can be in. Your vigor, there you are going to find honor, glory, and riches. He promised them meals, loot, and most significantly dignity. Napoleon understood whatever most generals did not. Struggle was once not simplest, a subject of weapons and men, but in addition of morale and delusion. By way of bulletins, speeches, and proclamations, he started to build the parable of the invincible military of Italy, and of himself as its chosen chief. This use of propaganda, which might develop even more subtle in later campaigns, grew to become one among Napoleon's defining weapons. He controlled the narrative, turning battles into epics and defeats into noble sacrifices. The Lightning Campaign, divide and triumph over inside weeks. Napoleon launched his first offensive against the mixed Austrian and Piedmontese forces. His crusade used to be centered on an easy but innovative method: velocity, surprise, and separation. He aimed to maneuver swiftly between enemy armies, stopping them from uniting and defeating them piecemeal. This grew to become referred to as the process of the principal role, a trademark of his navy genius. Montenot and Millesimo, April 1796. In a fast sequence of maneuvers, Napoleon struck on the Austro-Piedmontese coalition. At Mont, he outflanked the enemy and achieved a decisive victory. He then followed up with swift attacks at Millesimo and Dago, disorienting the enemy and forcing the Austrians to retreat. What made these victories unique was not simply the final result, but the method where they have been executed. Napoleon outmarched, outconcept, and outfought armies better and higher equipped than his possessed Lodi. The start of the Little Corporal. After defeating the Piedmontese, Napoleon became his full attention to the Austrians. On May 10, 1796, he crossed the Ada River at Lodi, where the Austrians had fortified a bridge with cannons. The crossing used to be brutal. Under heavy hearth, French grenadiers stormed the bridge, prompted by using Napoleon himself, who stood amidst the chaos, rallying the troops. The victory at Lodi was now not strategically relevant, but psychologically, it was transformative. Napoleon later wrote, "It used to be at Lodi that I first saw myself as a person of destiny." From this point forward, he was now not merely a general. He was once a logo. His troops commenced calling him Le Petit, Caporal, the Little Corporal, a nickname reflecting each affection and admiration. The man who had as soon as been mocked as a foreign outsider used to be now a residing legend. The siege of Mantua, stalemate and method. Napoleon pressed ahead, taking Milan and far of northern Italy. But Austria used to be no longer yet defeated. The fortress metropolis of Mantua became the focal factor of the campaign. From there, Austria would launch assaults to reclaim misplaced territory. The siege of Mantua would end up considered one of Napoleon's most complicated challenges. The Austrians launched 4 important comfort attempts between July 1796 and February 1797. At any time when Napoleon defeated them in the discipline by means of masterful use of terrain, timing, and troop deployment. Above all, The combat of Arcole, November 1796, and combat of Revailles, January 1797, displayed his capability to inspire exhausted troops, improvise under stress, and switch talents' mess-ups into resounding victories. At Arcole, Napoleon famously grabbed a flag and tried to guide a cost throughout a narrow bridge underneath fireplace, even as this just about obtained him killed. The act rallied the French forces to victory. With the aid of February 1797, Mantua surrendered. The Austrians had misplaced over 50,000 guys in their makes, an attempt to retake northern Italy. Napoleon had achieved what no earlier French basic had: whole manage over the northern Italian plain. Revolution from the saddle. The export of republicanism. Napoleon's victories were not best military. As he evolved via Italy, he brought with him the ideals and contradictions of the French Revolution. He dissolved monarchies, abolished feudal privileges, and based sister republics in locations like Lombardy and Modena. These client states had been nominally impartial, however, had been effectively beneath French manipulate. They served twin functions, extending France's impact and financing Napoleon's army. Artwork and wealth flowed again to France. Masterpieces from Italian church buildings and palaces had been packed onto wagons and dispatched to Paris, destined for the Louvre. Critics would later call this looting, but Napoleon noticed it as a transfer of cultural enlightenment at the same time. Napoleon used to be fitting greater than just a soldier. He was once performing as a ruler, a lawgiver, and a statesman. He appointed administrators, negotiated treaties, and reorganized cities. His capacity to shift from battlefield systems to political restructuring was a preview of the emperor he would later become. The Treaty of Campo Formio, normal as diplomatic means of spring 1797. Napoleon's navy was once poised to march on Vienna. The Austrians, reeling from successive defeats, sued for peace. On October 17, 1797, the Treaty of Campo Formio was once signed. Napoleon negotiated the treaty himself, much to the irritation of the French Government, which was once alarmed through his developing independence. The treaty redrew the map of Europe. France gained Belgium and enormous components of the Rhineland. Austria ceded Venice to Napoleon's new Cisalpine Republic in Italy. The first coalition quite simply collapsed at it. He used to be an unbelievable diplomatic fulfillment. Napoleon had long gone to Italy as a normal. He returned as a kingmaker. The hero returns. Fear in Paris when Napoleon back to Paris in late 1797. He was once probably the most famous man in France. Crowds greeted him as a conquering hero. Newspapers lionized him. Pamphlets circulated his photo like that of a modern-day famous person. However, now, not every person celebrated. Members of the listing have been increasingly uneasy. Napoleon's popularity dwarfed their own. His charisma, his victories, and his potential to rally public opinion made him a chance to the delicate stability of energy. They might no longer but stop him, however they would try to distract him. They proposed that he lead an expedition to Egypt to strike at British pursuits, a long way from the corridors of vigour in Paris. Napoleon permitted. Egypt could be his next stage, but his ambitions were already moving past military conquest. The boy from Corsica, once mocked and marginalized, was now a man who noticed empires in the palm of his hand. Conclusion: genius rising. The Italian campaign of 1796 to 1797 marked the proper emergence of Napoleon Bonaparte as a yawl drive. In lower than 2 years, he had taken a shattered navy and solid it into one of the vital feared forces in Europe. He had defeated considered one of Europe's quality powers, redrawn borders, spread progressive beliefs, and became himself right into a household identifier. Yet this chapter additionally marks the commencing of something darker. Napoleon's success was once intoxicating. He started out to peer himself, no longer in simple terms as a servant of the Republic, however, as its embodiment. The seeds of ambition, already planted, now started to bloom. Was once he a genius reshaping Europe with imaginative and prescient and talent? Or used to be he a tyrant in waiting, utilizing battle and propaganda to organize his ascent? The solutions would come within the next campaign within the deserts of Egypt and the politics of Paris. By way of the spring of 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte had reached unparalleled repute in France. He was no longer only a basic used to be a countrywide hero, a logo of innovative force and renewal, but the political elite in Paris, notably the ruling listing, had begun to see him now not simplest as their brightest star, but additionally as their most harmful danger, too standard, too formidable, too unpredictable, so that they devised a plan to remove him elegantly, ship him far from Europe, some distance from the vigorous struggles of Paris, and direct his ambitions somewhere else. They gave him the command of an individual mission, to conquer Egypt, undermine Britain's entry to India, and reshape the geopolitical chessboard of the 18th century. The plan was once both strategic and diplomatic. It received Napoleon out of the capital, at the same time expanding the French sphere of influence. What adopted was one of the crucial, distinctive military expeditions in cutting-edge historical, past a surreal fusion of warfare, empire-building, scientific exploration, and personal myth-making. In Egypt, Napoleon would, in finding both triumph and tragedy, he would win battles in the sand, rewrite the historic file of a civilization, and lose a fleet in fire and cannon. And in doing so, he would take one step towards the throne of France, that the Japanese dream. Why Egypt? In the late 18th century, Egypt used to be a land of faded glory, dominated in title by means of the Ottoman Empire but managed in observe with the aid of the Mamluks army elites who governed with swords and gold. Although gone its high, Egypt remained a situation of fascination for European powers. Strategically placed on the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe, it managed the valuable exchange routes between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. Whoever held Egypt would probably block Britain's entry to India, its most prized colony. Napoleon used to be captivated by means of the thought of an Eastern Empire. He had learned Alexander the High quality and Caesar obsessively, and he saw himself as an ultra-modern incarnation of each. He dreamed of marching into Asia, igniting Muslim rebellion towards the British in India, and constructing an empire that stretched from Cairo to Calcutta. However, Egypt supplied more than only a geopolitical possibility. It was also a stage on which to perform the Enlightenment ideals of science, purpose, and civilization. Napoleon didn't simply bring in military to Egypt. He brought a cultural invasion. An army of squaddies and scholars in May just 1798. Napoleon left Toulon with a tremendous fleet, 400 ships and over 35,000 soldiers. But among the many were additionally 167 savant scientists, engineers, artists, and linguists recruited from the best universities and institutions of France. This unprecedented workforce fashioned the Commission des Sciences et des Arts, tasked with studying Egypt, cataloguing its antiquities, and elevating the campaign right into a cultural mission. This twin-nature army conquest, paired with scientific exploration, was distinctive within the annals of battle. On no account earlier than had a general attempted to subdue folks, whilst concurrently documenting their history and measuring their pyramids. In doing so, Napoleon attempted to cast himself as greater than a basic. He would become a bringer of civilization, a philosopher king whose legacy would stretch past battlefields, the voyage, and the shadow of Nelson as the French fleet crossed the Mediterranean. It used to be pursued relentlessly by using the British Royal Navy, commanded by means of probably the most finest admirals in British history, Horatio Nelson. Unknown to Napoleon, Nelson was searching him with a fleet of equal dimension, and the two played a detrimental recreation of naval cat-and-mouse through the blue waters of the Mediterranean. Napoleon managed to elude Nelson and reached Malta in June 1798. There he captured the island in just a few days, abolishing the ancient and anachronistic rule of the Knights of St. John. From Malta, he sailed on toward Alexandria. Nelson, in the meantime, was He sailed prior the French fleet at one point, missing it by means of only a few hours. This lapse would have catastrophic penalties for Napoleon and epic ones for the British Empire. Arrival in Egypt, Battle of the Pyramids on July 1, 1798. Napoleon landed in Egypt. His forces quickly took Alexandria after intense avenue fighting. The French soldiers, dressed in heavy wool uniforms, started out to undergo right away from heat, dehydration, and disorder. However, Napoleon pushed them ahead towards Cairo, across the harsh terrain of the Egyptian barren region. On July 21st, Napoleon encountered the entire Code of the Mamluk cavalry at the Battle of the Pyramids. The Mamluks, clad in golden armor and armed with curved swords, launched cost after cost towards the French traces. However, Napoleon had predicted their strategies. He organized his troops into colossal infantry squares, every bristling with bayonets and artillery on the corners. the effect used to be a bloodbath. Over 6,000 Mamluks were killed, in comparison with fewer than 300 French casualties. It was once a decisive victory, and Napoleon seized Cairo days later, to the clicking again in France. He dispatched this iconic line: "From the heights of these pyramids, 40 centuries seem down upon you." Though apocryphal, the phrase captured the mythic tone Napoleon used to be cultivating. He used to be not merely a conqueror, he used to be communing with history itself, the savants, and the invention of Old Egypt. Even as his army secured control of scaled-back Egypt, Napoleon's staff of scholars fanned out across the land. They performed archaeological digs, measured temples, catalogued natural world, and created certain maps of the Nile Valley. Their most noted discovery came in 1799, the Rosetta Stone, a slab inscribed in 3 languages, Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphics, that might ultimately allow the modern world to decipher the old Egyptian language. Napoleon ordered the newsletter of their findings in an enormous multi-quantity work titled Description de l'Egypte. It grew to become one of the vital, greatest scholarly achievements of the 19th century and is a lead-launched trendy Egyptology. However, despite these accomplishments, the reality on the ground was more complicated and extra unsafe. The Battle of the Nile, Napoleon's strategic catastrophe. Napoleon used to be consolidating manipulate over Egypt. Nelson finally caught up with him simply too late to preclude the touchdown. But on August 1, 1798, Nelson struck the French fleet where it was once most vulnerable, at anchor in Abukir Bay. The fight of the Nile was a disaster for the French. In a lovely show of naval brilliance, Nelson attacked from both sides, taking pictures or destroying just about every French ship. The explosion of the flagship L'Orient lit the nighttime sky in an apocalyptic fireball. Over 1,700 French sailors had been killed. Napoleon's military was now stranded in Egypt. The British had whole naval supremacy in the Mediterranean. No reinforcements, no resupply, no breakout. Napoleon, however, did not panic. He led to his troops, telling them the French fleet had been successful. He doubled down on constructing his Japanese empire. However, the tides were turning. Resistance and rebellion. The Cairo riot through late 1798. Napoleon was struggling to manipulate Egypt. Despite early victories, his presence used to be increasingly resented. The Egyptians, deeply devout and culturally distinct, noticed the French as invaders, regardless of how many Enlightenment values they proclaimed. In October 1798, a full-scale rebellion erupted in Cairo. French infantrymen have been murdered. In the streets, mosques broadcast calls for jihad. Napoleon replied with brutal efficiency. He shelled town, carried out religious leaders, and re-established control, however at quality price, to his snapshot. To the Muslim world, Napoleon used to be no liberator. He used to be a CCU imperialist who desecrated mosques and suppressed neighborhood traditions. In and try and win want. Napoleon even issued a statement claiming sympathy with Islam, calling the Prophet Muhammad a quality man. However, few were satisfied. The dream of a Japanese empire was beginning to unravel. The Syrian Crusade, from triumph to tragedy. Undeterred, Napoleon grew to become north in early 1799. He invaded Ottoman Syria, modern-day Israel, Lebanon and Syria, hoping to strike at the heart of the Ottoman resistance and attain territory. Alongside the coast, the campaign started out with success victories at El Arish and Gaza. However, as the French moved deeper into the Levant, resistance stiffened. At Jaffa, Napoleon dedicated one of the controversial acts of his career. After taking town, he ordered the execution of over 2,000 Ottoman prisoners, most of whom had surrendered under the promise of fair healing. The bloodbath bowled over even a few of his possessed officers. Napoleon defended the act as an army necessity. He might not spare meals or guards, but the world noticed it in a different way. Worse still used to be the siege of Acre. Right here, Napoleon faced a small Ottoman garrison fortified by British naval support. Despite weeks of siege, the city held. Sickness ravaged the French army. Presents ran out. Morale collapsed. Napoleon's dream of marching into Asia ended on the gates of Acre. He used to be pressured to retreat, his military decimated and dissatisfied. The secret return to France through mid-1799. The main issue in Egypt had become untenable. French rule was once more and more unstable. British ships dominated the ocean, and rumors reached Napoleon of political chaos in Paris. The Directory used to be faltering. France needed a savior. Napoleon made a fateful determination. In August 1799, he boarded a small ship and fled Egypt, forsaking his military to return to France. It was once a daring, even selfish act, but it surely paid off. When he arrived in Paris, he determined a government on the breaking point. The individuals were weary of revolution, chaos, and incompetence. Napoleon, the hero of Italy and the visionary of Egypt, looked like the only man ready. Of restoring order, he was greeted not as a deserter, however, as a deliverer. Within weeks, he would stage a coup and seize energy for himself. Conclusion: illusions within the sand. The Egyptian crusade is likely one of the most paradoxical episodes in Napoleon's life. On one hand, it was an army and logistical failure. The French fleet was destroyed. Egypt was once on no account absolutely pacified, and the Syrian crusade led to retreat. But on the other hand, the campaign reshaped European mental historical past, launched present-day Egyptology, and burnished Napoleon's legend as a state-of-the-art day Alexander. It revealed his daring, his thirst for legacy, and his boundless self-confidence. Extra importantly, it proven that Napoleon was not content material to serve a republic. He wanted to rule it. Through the autumn of 1799, France was exhausted. After 10 years of revolution, bloodshed, warfare, and political upheaval, the dream of liberty had decayed into a nightmare of factionalism and fear. The streets of Paris not rang with cries of liberté, eagle-eyed, fraternite, but with whispers of conspiracy, plots, and coups. The listing, the five-man executive body situated after the fall of Robespierre, was once flailing. Its authority used to be weak, its leadership corrupt, and its legitimacy in tatters. France was drifting towards chaos another time. Then came a reputation that would still encourage confidence, awe, and worry. Napoleon Bonaparte. Though he had left his military at the back of in Egypt in August 1799, his return to Paris was something, however, shameful. By means of his tremendous manipulation of reports and public opinion, Napoleon had turned even failure into triumph. He arrived no longer as a fugitive basic, but as a savior returning in France's darkest hour. The people cheered him, the politicians tolerated him, the navy loved him. What followed was some of the audacious energy grabs in European historical past. The coup of 18 Brumaire, named after the progressive calendar date, November 9, 1799. In only a few days, Napoleon would dismantle the remains of the French Republic and set up himself as first consul, protecting close absolute vigour. This chapter explores how a young basic backed by army loyalty, political calculation, and public desperation managed to finish a revolution and his own reign. France in predicament. The superb storm. To appreciate how Napoleon seized energy so without difficulty, one ought to first appreciate just how precarious the French state had come to be. Through 1799, the listing had been situated in 1795 as a compromise between revolutionary idealism and a return to order. It used to be composed of 5 administrators who ruled at the same time, with a legislature cut up into 2 chambers, the Council of 500 Shrink Condo and the Council of Ancients Higher Condominium. In thought, this system was designed to restrict tyranny. In apply, it ended in gridlock, corruption, and endless coups. With the aid of 1799, the listing was besieged on both sides. Army defeats in Germany and Italy, in opposition to the Second Coalition. Austria, Russia, Britain, and others had reversed lots of France's previous positive factors. Financial trouble had back. Inflation, meals, shortages, and rising bread prices reminded residents of the worst days of the revolution. Royalist uprisings have been resurfacing, principally in western France. Jacobin and radicals have been calling for a return to Robespierre's purist vision of the Republic. Political infighting inside. The listing itself rendered it paralyzed and discredited. In this atmosphere, many French residents, exhausted by a decade of instability, longed no longer for more revolution, but for a return to order. Many no longer cared whether or not that order got here from a republic, a monarchy, or a dictatorship, as long as it ended the chaos. And into that vacuum stepped Napoleon. The return from Egypt. Timing is everything. Napoleon arrived in Paris on October 16, 1799. He did so without legal authorization from the Directory. Correctly, his return technically broke army protocol and left his navy in Egypt without leadership or instructions. However, the listing dared no longer punish him. He used to be nonetheless the national hero of the Italian campaign. His name, on my own, carried titanic weight. The men and women welcomed him with cheers. Newspapers printed his speeches. Artists painted his likeness. The myth of Napoleon had again earlier than the person himself walked via Paris. Even the listings possessed participants had been divided. Some, like Emmanuel Joseph Size, one of the vital usual authors of the innovative Gouved, noticed in Napoleon a expertise, companion or software. Size had been quietly planning a coup of his own. He desired to switch the ineffective constitution with a more effective authoritarian regime, but one who maintained the looks of republicanism. He wanted a sword. Napoleon used to be that sword, but, in contrast to what Size imagined, Napoleon often is the one to wield it. The conspirators, a coup in the making in secret. A small workforce of powerful guys commenced planning the overthrow of the Directory. Napoleon Bonaparte, the fashionable general, calculating and ambitious. Emmanuel Size, the ideologue, desperate to reform the state. Roger Ducos, an average Directory member, willing to go together with change. Lucien Bonaparte, Napoleon's more youthful brother and president of the Council of 500. Joseph Fouch, the Minister of Police, a master of surveillance and intrigue. Charles Maurice, de Talleyrand, the cynical diplomat, normally on the successful side. Collectively, they crafted a plan to convince the legislature that a Jacobin uprising threatened Paris, transferred the legislative chambers to the safer suburb of St. Cloud, and used the opportunity to neutralize the Directory and set up a new government with Napoleon at its head. They set the date, 18 Brumaire, 12 months, 8 of the progressive calendar, November 9th, 1799. Day 1, November 9th, 1799, the fall of the Directory on the morning of 18 Brumaire. Confusion and rumors unfold across Paris. Handbills and newspapers warned of a Jacobin conspiracy. Troops loyal to Napoleon took positions throughout town, surrounding executive constructions and securing key locations. Paris didn't upward push in alarm. It was too used to coups. 3 of the 5 administrators resigned immediately. Size, Ducos and Barras, the same man who had in the beginning extended Napoleon after the 13 Vendemiaire revolt. That left to Goya and Mullen, who refused to step down. Napoleon arrived at the Luxembourg Palace, house of the listing. Surrounded by using grenadiers, he confronted the remaining administrators and demanded their resignation. They refused, so he positioned them under house arrest. The Directory, the final remnant of the Revolutionary Republic, effectively ceased to function. However, the actual experiment would come on the following day, when the legislative chambers met in St. Cloud Day. 2. November 10th, 1799. Chaos in St. Cloud at St. Cloud. The Council of Ancients and the Council of 500 gathered underneath heavy navy safeguard. They had been instructed, they had been meeting to debate emergency powers and skills constitutional reform. Most deputies had no notion they had been pawns in a coup. Napoleon arrived in full military gown and entered the Council of Ancients, which speedily gave him command of all troops in Paris to defend the Republic. To this point, so excellent. Then came the disaster. Napoleon, emboldened by means of the morning's success, marched into the Council of 500, the lower apartment, with a small escort. It was once a grave mistake. The deputies, a lot of whom hated him or feared navy dictatorship, erupted in fury. They accused him of violating the sanctity of the legislature, of staging a coup. Cries of "Down with the tyrant" and "Outlaw him" filled the corridor. Some drew knives. Napoleon stammered by way of a speech, invoking the revolution, the persons, and the republic, but the chaos drowned him out. Bodily shaken, he fled the chamber. For a moment, the coup teetered on the threshold of failure. However, then Bonaparte, as president of the Council of 500, rose to the moment. He stood before the troops external and declared that the chamber had been taken over by way of violent radicals. He swore that his possessed brother would certainly not betray the revolution until the chamber itself had betrayed it. He referred to as on the soldiers to behave. They usually did. Grenadiers stormed the council chamber and expelled the deputies by way of drive. The legislature was dissolved at bayonet factor. The revolution had ended, now not with a roar of the men and women, However, with the stomp of infantryman, boots on a marble flooring. Aftermath, the upward thrust of the consulate with the Directory dismantled and the legislature disbanded. The path was clear. Napoleon and his allies drafted a brand new structure, the Constitution of 12 months. 8. It situated a new executive authority, the consulate. Although it looked as if it would share energy among three consuls, Napoleon, Size, and Ducos, the fact was clear from the begin. Napoleon held the real vigour as first consul, the opposite to have been figureheads. The new government centralized authority, curtailed civil liberties, and headquartered a secret police, but also introduced steadiness, financial reforms, and army revival. For many French residents, the trade-off was worth it. A decade of bloodshed had ended. The revolution used to be over. A new era had begun. Napoleon's justification. The parable of legitimacy. Within the weeks following the coup, Napoleon flooded France with proclamations and speeches. He didn't describe the coup as a power grasp. Alternatively, he cast himself as a reluctant savior, a person pressured with the aid of patriotism to rescue France from incompetence and division. Citizens, the revolution is constant on the standards which commenced it. It is finished. He promised to restore order, uphold equality, guard property, and revive national glory. His propaganda computing device labored tirelessly. The individuals were informed that the coup had saved them from chaos. Most approved the brand new regime with alleviation. Some cheered. A couple have resisted. However, the tide had grew to become the French Republic, born in blood and idealism, had given way to the iron will of one man. What is it, a coup or a correction? Historians proceed to debate that means of 18 Brumaire used to be it, a betrayal of the revolution, or its logical conclusion. To royalists, it was a temporary compromise, a navy strongman who might at some point repair monarchy. To republicans, it was once a catastrophe, the loss of life of democracy through military boot. To moderates, it used to be a pragmatic necessity, only way to store France from civil conflict. To Napoleon, it used to be destiny. It's worth noting that the word coup d'etat entered modern political vocabulary due to Napoleon's moves in 1799. The event grew to become the textbook mannequin of how to grab vigor with no well-known uprising, manipulation, army loyalty, and authorized fiction. Conclusion: from common to ruler with the stroke of a pen and the flash of a bayonet, Napoleon Bonaparte converted himself from a soldier of the Republic into its ruler. The coup of 18 Brumaire was once now not conveniently a political event. It used to be the moment the ideals of the revolution were changed through the ambitions of one man. France had found its grasp. However, this used to be simplest, the beginning. As first consul, Napoleon would go on to reform French law, revive the navy, dominate Europe, and crown himself emperor. But the seeds of each, his greatness and his downfall, have been planted in these fateful 2 days in November 1799. He had learn how to take energy. Now he would gain knowledge of methods to wield it. The smoke of the 18 Brumaire coup had barely cleared when Napoleon Bonaparte assumed the title First Consul of the French Republic. On the surface, he was once basically the absolute best, rating legit in a 3-man governed committee. Truly, he used to be now the most powerful man in France, with mind-blowing velocity and authority. Napoleon got down to do whatever his predecessors had failed at for a decade: rebuild a damaged nation. From 1799 to 1804, for the duration of what grew to become often called the consulate, Napoleon presented sweeping reforms that touched each corner of French life: authorized, academic, economic, military, devout, and political. He styled himself as a restorer, as a substitute, then a usurper, claiming that he had ended the chaos of the revolution without destroying its ideals. This chapter explores the consulate years, a period most of the time overshadowed by way of Napoleon's later imperial glory, but arguably extra important. It used to be in these 5 years that Napoleon proved now not most effective his tactical brilliance, but in addition his administrative genius, revealing the best line between statesmanship and autocracy. A brand new constitution, a new Francism. Weeks after the coup, a new structure, Year 8, was drafted and rushed by way of a rigged plebiscite, even as it paid lip provided to democratic beliefs. The actual power was focused within the palms of the first consul Napoleon. Key aspects of the constitution of Year 8: a strong executive led by way of 3 consuls, but best the primary consul. Napoleon held actual authority. The legislative method used to be complicated and neutered, divided amongst 4 assemblies, none of which could initiate laws. Citizens could vote, however, only to type lists from which officials were appointed. In no longer direct representation, the appearance of republicanism was maintained, but at the back of the curtain was once a centralizing regime. Napoleon made use of plebiscites, istandakaji referenda, as political theatre. In February 1800, the primary such vote confirmed 3 million in want, and only 1,500 against the new structure of path. The numbers had been inflated and manipulated, but it surely gave Napoleon the legitimacy he wanted. He was not only a positive basic, he was now France's chosen chief, stabilizing the state. Napoleon's reforms. 1. Legal reform. The Napoleonic Code, in all Napoleon's most enduring legacies, was the Code Civil des Franquets, later known as the Napoleonic Code. France, previous to Napoleon, had no unified authorized method. Laws diverged from province to province, based on royal decrees, feudal customs, and innovative edicts. In 1804, after years of drafting and debate, the Civil Code was once accomplished. Its core principles, equality earlier than the regulation, no more privileges situated on birth, secular law, church, legal guidelines had been excluded from civil matters, property rights, strengthened the sanctity of exclusive possession, patriarchal authority, ladies and children have been subordinate to the male head of loved ones, meritocracy, positions in the civil provider and navy had been officially open to talent, though modern in some areas. The code additionally rolled back specific, innovative, beneficial properties, notably for women, who misplaced many rights they had briefly gained in the course of the Revolution. The code unfolded across Europe throughout Napoleon's conquests and grew to be the groundwork of state-of-the-art authorized systems in countries like Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and materials of Latin the United States. It used to be each a tool of reform and of imperial control. 2. Administrative reform. Prefects and principal. Vigour. Napoleon believed in order by means of centralization. He restructured the executive map of France, dividing it into departments, each ruled by a prefect, a bureaucrat, appointed instantly by Paris. These prefects reported to the Ministry of the Internal and ensured that Napoleon's legal guidelines were carried out uniformly. Gone had been the chaotic days of progressive self-rule in cities and villages. Of their place stood a hierarchical, efficient paperwork that acted with navy precision. Education, policing, taxation, and justice grew to become streamlined below this new mannequin. Napoleon also reformed the tax approach, introducing the Cour des Comptes court docket of audit to monitor public finances. He modernized land registries, cracked down on fraud, and increased the collection of indirect taxes comparable to salt, tobacco, and wine. 3. Schooling, training residents and servants of the state to construct a stable society. Napoleon turned to schooling. He noticed it as a tool for coaching loyal, expert residents, in particular civil servants, judges, and military officers. Key reforms: production of lycees, state and secondary colleges, where a standardized curriculum emphasized mathematics, science, Latin, and historical past, but now not political philosophy or dissent. The tuition of France used to be established to centralize and oversee all levels of education. Emphasis used to be positioned on advantage over birth, even though the procedure more and more liked the sons of the bourgeoisie and army households. Napoleon's schooling process produced the spine of the present-day French elite, obedient, technocratic, and loyal to the state, in particular. Else, for religion, the Concordat of 1801, even though raised Catholic, Napoleon had no interest in religion for its own sake. He saw the Catholic Church as a way of selling social stability. After years of innovative dechristianization, which had alienated hundreds of thousands of French residents, Napoleon sought reconciliation with the Church. In 1801, he signed the Concordat with Pope Pius VII, recognizing Catholicism as the faith of the majority of French citizens, whilst keeping freedom of religion for Protestants and Jews. Keyword: phrases. The Church renounced claims to confiscated lands. Clergy were to be paid via the state, however appointed by way of Napoleon. Devout faculties reopened underneath state oversight. This pragmatic deal placated religious conservatives while retaining state supremacy. Napoleon even reopened church buildings, however, made sure every pulpit knew who their real grasp was, opposition, and managed Napoleon's regime used to be, now, not without resistance. Royalists, Jacobin, and exiled revolutionaries plotted in secret. Assassination attempts were made, most specifically the plot of the Rue Saint-Denis in December 1800. When a bomb narrowly neglected Napoleon's carriage, Napoleon spoke back with elevated police surveillance, led via the sinister Joseph Fouché, censorship of newspapers, decreasing the quantity in Paris from 70 to just 13. Repression of dissent, together with exile or execution of suspected plotters. Regardless of his progressive rhetoric, Napoleon confirmed no tolerance for political pluralism. He consolidated vigor, stifled free expression, and ruled with growing private control. Yet many permitted this trade-off for the steadiness he offered. Foreign policy and the return to war in early 1800, Napoleon turned back to what had made his identify, conflict. Despite the revolution's fatigue, France was nonetheless embroiled in conflict with the Second Coalition. Austria remained the major enemy in Europe. Napoleon marched to Italy and scored a decisive victory at Marengo, June 1800, reasserting French manipulate in northern Italy. Subsequent campaigns introduced more victories, leading to the Treaty of Luneville, Etem Barbai Ligny with Austria, and the Treaty of Amiens 1802 with Britain, the first peace between the two powers in a decade. However, this peace was once fragile. The British seen Napoleon's enlargement into the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Italy as breaches of the peace. With the aid of 1803, struggle resumed, setting the stage for the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon now needed greater than temporary titles. He wanted permanence. The path to emperor in 1802, a brand new plebiscite, made Napoleon first consul for existence, with over 99% approval. One other sham, yes, but it surely mirrored how dependent France had come to be on his leadership. Progressive ideals of liberty and republicanism had given method to protection, prosperity, and pleasure in French power. Napoleon now commenced, styling himself more like a monarch. He lived in palaces, wore Roman-prompted robes, and used imperial imagery. He created a legion of honor to reward loyalty. Quite simply, anew the aristocracy. He mentioned dynasty, succession, and countrywide destiny. The ultimate step came in 1804. A new structure used to be drawn up, and one more plebiscite accepted the exchange. Napoleon was once now to be called Emperor of the French, but that's a story for the following chapter. Legacy of the Consulate Temporary. The consulate was once arguably the best and transformative section of Napoleon's career. In these 5 years, he reconstructed a broken society, revived a failing state, and solidified power in his own palmsole without firing a single cannon in Paris. Key legacies: the Napoleonic Code, still the foundation of many civil law systems, a centralized, meritocratic forms, a trendy educational method fascinated with countrywide carrier, a reconciled but subordinate church, a tradition of plebiscitary authoritarianism, where legitimacy got here from managed, well-known votes. However, these achievements got here at a rate: the suppression of political freedom, the erosion of innovative pluralism, the foundation of a private dictatorship. In many ways, Napoleon completed the revolution with the aid of ending it. He kept its reforms, rejected its chaos, and crowned its ruins with the throne. Conclusion: a nation remade, a crown watching for. By means of 1804, France had transformed past cognizance. The ideals of the revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity, had been reshaped into pillars of statecraft, discipline, and manage. The republic used to be alive in title, but useless in spirit. At the middle stood one man, Napoleon Bonaparte, first consul for lifestyles, soon to be emperor. He had used peace as skillfully as he as soon as used battle. He had wielded reform as cleverly as he once maneuvered artillery. He had satisfied a nation to give up its freedoms for the promise of greatness. The individuals had chosen order over liberty, and now they'd choose a crown over a constitution. It was a bloodless morning in Paris, the sky draped in wintry clouds, as hundreds of thousands lined the streets on December 2nd, 1804. The historic bells of Notre Dame Cathedral tolled solemnly, their echoes cascading over the Seine. Throughout the grand cathedral, gilded in attractiveness and rearranged for an imperial ceremony unlike any France had visible. A nation waited breathlessly to witness its most awesome transformation, but Napoleon Bonaparte, as soon as an artillery officer in a collapsing monarchy, now stood on the precipice of an individual evolution. Now not first consul of a progressive republic, he was about to come to be emperor of the French. Yet this was no longer only a coronation. It was a cautiously orchestrated spectacle of legitimacy, ambition, symbolism, and myth-making. Napoleon was not just assuming a title, he was once rewriting the script of history. This chapter explores the hobby's main as much as and following Napoleon's coronation, inspecting its rituals, messages, and the profound implications of France's transition from progressive state to imperial dynasty. Used to be it the triumph of genius or the betrayal of liberty. From consul to emperor, engineering a crown, Napoleon's ambitions had lengthily outgrown the modest robes of first consul. Though he had centralized vigour, reformed associations, and vanquished overseas threats, one query lingered: what would come after him? The Republic had no clear mechanism for succession. If Napoleon died, or used to be assassinated, would France descend again into chaos? His answer used to be audacious: an empire, born not from monarchy however, from the need of the persons. The imperial decree in May just 1804. The Senate, dominated by loyal Bonapartists, proclaimed Napoleon as Emperor of the French beneath a brand new constitution of year 12, not Emperor of France, as kings had as soon as been, however, Emperor of the French, a subtle however gigantic change, suggesting his authority derived no longer from divine proper. However, the sovereignty of the nation, a plebiscite used to be held in November 1804. Reliable results confirmed 3.5 million votes in desire, with barely 2,500 antagonistic. Actually, it used to be theatre voters had been pressured, ballots managed, but Napoleon had what he wanted: well-known legitimacy for imperial rule. A coronation, not like every other Napoleon, did not need a coronation steeped in Bourbon culture or progressive secularism. He desired a fusion of IHA, brand new ritual for a brand new technology, combining Christian solemnity, Roman grandeur, and revolutionary symbolism. Notre Dame de Paris, the chosen stage, the cathedral, beforehand desecrated for the period of the Revolution and became a temple of purpose, was once now restored and changed for this singular event. Draped in crimson and gold, decorated with imperial bees, Napoleon's chosen image of immortality and energy. It sparkled like a temple of empire. Pope Pius VII, a papal witness, not a kingmaker. Napoleon bowled over Europe via inviting Pope Pius VII to preside over the ceremony. It had been centuries considering a pope crossed the Alps for such a intent, but Napoleon had no intention of letting the church crown him. On the day of the coronation, in entrance of enormous quantities of dignitaries, bishops, diplomats, navy, officers, and members of Napoleon's new courtroom, the moment got here. As the Pope, ready to anoint the emperor, Napoleon seized the crown himself, grew to become to face the crowd, and placed it on his possessed head. It was an electrifying gesture. God gave it to me. Pay attention, he who touches it. Napoleon, as later recalled via courtiers, the message was once clear: no divine right, no church authority, no royal bloodline. Napoleon's energy got here from himself, and by extension, from the nation. Then he crowned Josephine, his wife, as empress once more, along with his own hands, imperial regalia and symbolism. Napoleon's coronation regalia was cautiously curated to combo the earlier and future. He wore a golden laurel wreath, just like the Roman Caesars. His robes echoed these of Charlemagne, the medieval emperor he sought to emulate. The hand of justice, the scepter, and the sword of Charlemagne had been all featured, evoking royal mystique. The imperial bees, taken from the tomb of Merovingian King Childeric I, symbolized immortality and the old roots of French kingship. Even the paintings used to be propaganda. Jacques-Louis David's iconic painting, The Coronation of Napoleon, depicts the second Napoleon crowns Josephine with the Pope, seated passively in the heritage, fingers raised but unneeded. It was a visual manifesto. Napoleon, not God, no longer Rome, was the supply of authority. Growing in imperial order, Napoleon immediately set about reworking the French state into a dynastic empire. The alterations were colossal and fast. 1. A new nobility in 1808. Napoleon re-established the aristocracy now, not of historical bloodlines however, of provider and benefit. Titles like Duke, Count, and Baron were awarded to generals, directors, and civil servants. Nevertheless, this new elite relied completely on Napoleon's preferment. Their titles came with tasks, and customarily with outland. It was nobility designed to bind loyalty, now not breed independence. 2. An imperial court docket modeled after the grandeur of Versailles. The imperial court docket featured its inflexible hierarchy of titles and honors, complicated court rituals and fashion, ladies-in-waiting, chamberlains, and grand officers. Josephine presided over the court with appeal and elegance, whilst Napoleon maintained strict manage over etiquette and discipline. 3. Succession plans. Napoleon had no children, and his brothers have been noticeable as politically unreliable. He named Joseph Bonaparte as his abilities inheritor, later exchanging him with his son from a second marriage. However, already he dreamed of building a Bonaparte dynasty that will rule Europe. Reactions at home and overseas. In France, mixed among many French citizens, the coronation was once met with a combination of pride and unease. Former Jacobin and Republicans noticed it as a betrayal of innovative beliefs. The bourgeoisie, who had won wealth and balance, mostly supported it. Peasants and Catholics welcomed the return to order and lifestyle. Royalists seen it as a usurpation of monarchy, however grudgingly admired its success. Most significantly, France was worn out of chaos. Napoleon's empire promised continuity, glory, and prosperity. In Europe, alarm and disgust. European monarchs have been horrified. To them, Napoleon used to be a parvenu, a low-born basic defiling the sacred school of monarchy. Austria, Russia, Prussia, and Britain started out forming new coalitions. Pope Pius VII, lower back to Rome, upset, later becoming a prisoner of Napoleon. The Holy Roman Empire, already weakened, would soon fall down under pressure from Napoleon's reorganized Confederation of the Rhine. The coronation didn't conveniently crown Napoleon. It declared war on the historic order of Europe. The empire and its contradictions. Napoleon's empire used to be a paradox. It claimed to be modern, rational, and progressive, yet wrapped itself in the trappings of monarchy, dynasty, and imperial glory. Liberty was curtailed. Equality became inequality. Underneath, anew the aristocracy. Fraternity used to be changed with loyalty to at least one man. But Napoleon believed this synthesis was quintessential. The revolution had destroyed the prior but built nothing lasting. He could be the architect of a new civilization, a French empire, grounded in advantage and power, not chaos and beliefs. Legacy of the coronation. The coronation marked the authentic dying of the French First Republic, and the delivery of a brand new political faith, Napoleonism. Key effects. It set the precedent for ultra-modern authoritarian populism, where rulers declare vigour via managed democracy. It established France as a hegemonic energy in Europe. It fused progressive beliefs with monarchical kind, influencing states from Germany to Latin, the United States. Greater than a ceremony, it was a rebranding of vigour, dressed in robes of history and adorned with illusions of fate. Conclusion. A crown worn by way of will. No longer blood. Napoleon didn't inherit his crown. He took it, now not from kings, but from revolution, ambition, and the vacuum of energy left with the aid of 10 years of terror and civil conflict. The persons cheered, the bells rang, and the guns fired. A new empire was born, now not of aristocrats and kings, but of bureaucrats, squaddies, and an emperor who claimed to be the servant of the individuals while he ruled them with an iron will. In that single act of self-coronation, Napoleon seized both crown and historical past, shaping himself into a myth that will outlive even his empire. When Napoleon topped himself emperor in 1804, it was once now not in simple terms a ceremonial announcement of vigour. It was a declaration of continental ambition. The French Revolution had already disrupted the ACU order, but Napoleon aimed to rebuild it now, not with diplomacy, however, with the iron and hearth of battle. Over the subsequent 2 years, he would unleash one of the crucial, most wonderful army campaigns in historical past. From the thunderous fields of Austerlitz to the frozen lakes of Arlau, Napoleon sought to bend Europe to his will, dismantle historical empires, and forge a French-led Europe beneath his design. But conquest got here at a cost: blood, resentment, uprising, and the seeds of his own eventual downfall. This chapter delves deep into Napoleon's grand campaigns from 1805 to 1807, the formation of the One-Third and Fourth Coalitions, the swift destruction of Austria, the humiliation of Prussia, and the stalemates with Russia. It explores not handiest the strategies and battles, but in addition the political maneuvering, propaganda, and brutal realities of Napoleonic struggle. A continent on the brink of Europe in the early 1800s was once a powder keg. Napoleon's upward push, coronation, and expansionist rhetoric had dispatched monarchies into panic. Although conflict-wary Britain, Austria, Russia, and Sweden saw Napoleon's empire as a risk to the steadiness of power and their survival. The One-Third Coalition was born in 1805. It used to be an alliance of Britain, funding and imparting the continental powers, Austria, seeking revenge for earlier defeats, Russia, afraid of French influence in important Europe, Sweden, becoming a member of below British stress and subsidies. Napoleon would now not watch for them to strike. The Ulm Crusade, a masterstroke in the autumn of 1805, Napoleon launched a preemptive strike into Germany, focusing on Austrian forces before Russian reinforcements could arrive. Strategic brilliance utilizing his newly reorganized Grande Armée, Napoleon executed a speedy and enveloping maneuver against Austrian basic Karl Mack, who had foolishly concentrated his forces at Ulm. As an alternative than fighter-pitched combat. Napoleon used mobility, deception, and coordination to encircle Mack's navy. In not up to a month, the French marched practically 500 kilometers with lovely velocity. Austrian supply strains have been severed. By using October 20th, Mack surrendered 30,000 men without a main fight. It used to be one of the crucial entire strategic victories in Navy historical past, and it set the stage for the genuine masterpiece to come back. Austerlitz, the combat of the three emperors on December 2, 1805. Precisely 1 year after his coronation, Napoleon confronted the combined Austro-Russian armies near the village of Austerlitz. In contemporary day, CZSIA. The atmosphere French forces, approximately 68,000 Allied forces, 85,000 below Tsar Alexander I and Emperor Francis I. Deception Napoleon feigned. Weak point, withdrawing from the Pratzen Heights, a strategic imperative plateau. The Allies took the bait, concentrating their forces on the French right flank, hoping to roll up his line. What they did not be aware of, Napoleon had hidden his elite corps below Marshal Soult, close the middle, ready to strike. The execution. Daybreak, as mist clung to the fields, the Allied assault commenced. Then, with timed precision, Napoleon ordered Soult to retake the Pratzen Heights, splitting the enemy in two. The corps collapsed. The Allies had been pushed into disarray. Hundreds drowned in frozen lakes by nightfall. Over 36,000 Allied troops have been lifeless, wounded, or captured. Napoleon lost best 8,000. Austerlitz was once greater than a combatite, used to be a symphony of action, deception, and timing. The One-Third Coalition crumbled. The Treaty of Pressburg and the fall of the Holy Roman Empire. After Austerlitz, Austria sued for peace. The Treaty of Pressburg, 1805, pressured, foremost, territorial concessions to France and its allies, cognizance of Napoleon's puppet states in Italy and Germany, Austria's robust retreat from European management. In 1806, the historic Holy Roman Empire, a 1,000-year historical college, was dissolved. Napoleon reorganized German states into the Confederation of the Rhine, with himself as protector. It was the death of the ancient European order and an instantaneous mission to Prussia and Russia. The Prussian Gambit and the Fourth Coalition. Prussia had remained impartial within the Third Coalition, but alarmed via French growth into Germany, it now mobilized. In 1806, Napoleon faced a brand new alliance, the Fourth Coalition, composed of Prussia, Russia, Saxony, Sweden, and Britain. The Prussians, led by way of generals still residing in the shadow of Frederick I, were gradual, disorganized, and underestimated Napoleon. Jena and Auerstedt. The crushing of Prussia. October 14, 1806, Napoleon confronted two Prussian armies at Jena and Auerstedt. At Jena, Napoleon, in my opinion, commanded. He defeated a Prussian force of 38,000. French maneuvering and artillery overwhelmed the stiff Prussian formations. At Auerstedt, Marshal Devout, with simply 26,000 guys, faced a larger Prussian military of 63,000. Regardless of the chances, Devout delivered a beautiful victory. Prussia was once shattered. Inside weeks, the Prussian capital, Berlin, was occupied. The Prussian navy ceased to exist as a robust force. Napoleon entered Berlin triumphantly, issuing the Berlin Decrees, initiating his monetary battle with Britain. It used to be humiliation for the once proud Prussian kingdom into the east. The Russian venture nonetheless, was far from beaten. Napoleon advanced into Poland, hoping to drive a decisive battle towards Tsar Alexander's army. The wintry weather crusade, 1806-1807. The fighting was once brutal and inconclusive. Combat of Eylau, February 1807. One in every of Napoleon's bloodiest battles. Bitter cold, snowstorms, and fog. Over 25,000 French and 20,000 Russian casualties. Neither aspect gained a decisive victory. Napoleon, for the primary time, had his fable of invincibility shaken. The soldiers of the Grand Army, exhausted and freezing, started out to doubt their leader's omnipotence. Friedland, redemption in blood in June 1807. Napoleon ultimately received his danger to conclude the Russians. At the Battle of Friedland, June 14th. French forces trapped the Russian navy close the Ali River. Intense artillery and cavalry attacks devastated the Russian line. Over 20,000 Russians, killed or wounded. Napoleon had reclaimed his air of mystery of invincibility. The Peace of Tilsit Empire, at its zenith following, Tsar Alexander met Napoleon at Tilsit, the place they signed one of the crucial iconic treaties in European history. On a raft in the center of the Niemen River. Key words: Russia agreed to the continental system. Napoleon's fiscal blockade against Britain. Prussia used to be dismembered. New consumer states, just like the Duchy of Warsaw, were based. Napoleon and Alexander feigned friendship, talking of carving up the sector. However, the peace was once constructed on mutual distrust. At this moment, Napoleon stood on the height of his vigor. He controlled France-Belgium-Holtringdale of Italy, Germany, via consumer states. Poland, by way of the Duchy of Warsaw. His brothers sat on international thrones: Joseph in Naples, Louis in Holland, and Jerome in Westphalia. However, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. The dark aspect of conquest, the rate of war for Napoleon's victories have been wonderful, but additionally savage. His armies looted, raped, and requisitioned as they marched. In many occupied areas, nationalist resistance simmered. Taxes were raised to fund French wars. Regional populations suffered famine and conscription. The Grande Armée effective. The Grande Army suffered over 200,000 casualties between 1805 and 1807. Unregular stress from elevated supply traces, developing discontent amongst conscripts, financial conflict. The Continental Method. Napoleon's Berlin and Milan decrees launched an economic battle towards Britain by banning trade between the continent and the British Isles. It damaged European economies more than Britain. Smuggling and black markets flourished. Neutral countries like Portugal and Spain resisted, planting the seeds for future revolts. Napoleon's empire, a tremendous with clay. By 1807, Napoleon's empire gave the impression unassailable. Yet its foundations have been already weakening. Conquest bred resentment. Occupation drained assets. Nationalist actions stirred in Spain, Germany, and Italy. Russia remained an uneasy ally. Britain, unconquered and defiant, stood because the eternal enemy. Napoleon had redrawn the map of Europe, but no longer its soul. His genius had gained him battles, but might it win peace? Conclusion: the price of glory. Between 1805 and 1807, Napoleon converted Europe by means of a whirlwind of navy genius. He destroyed ancient empires, constructed new states, and founded himself because the master of the continent. But every victory introduced new enemies, new fronts, and new challenges. The continent groaned under the weight of French boots. The seeds of rebellion took root, and the emperor, once a symbol of progressive promise, now dominated like a conqueror, genius, or tyrant. Perhaps each, but now, for the primary time, the bounds of his genius had been commencing to exhibit. By means of 1807, Napoleon stood at the zenith of his energy. He had humiliated Austria, beaten Prussia, and introduced Tsar Alexander to the negotiation table. His empire stretched across Europe, and his brothers dominated in Naples, Holland, and Westphalia. The British Isles on my own remained defiant. However, in his pursuit to economically suffocate Britain by way of the continental method, Napoleon made a catastrophic miscalculation. He turned his attention to the Iberian Peninsula. Spain and Portugal launched what he assumed could be a swift crusade to implement his blockade. What adopted was a bloody, drawn-out guerrilla warfare that may entangle thousands of hundreds of thousands of French troops, shatter the myth of Napoleonic invincibility, and come to be a moral and navy disaster for the empire. This chapter explores the factors, campaigns, horrors, and lasting have an effect on the Peninsular struggle. From 1807 to 1814, a conflict Napoleon would later name his Spanish ulcer, a faulty foundation. The continental system. After defeating Russia and Prussia, Napoleon, curious about his fiscal struggle with Britain, his Berlin 1806 and Milan decrees 1807 banned all European nations underneath French influence from trading with Britain. Portugal, historically allied with Britain and heavily reliant on British alternate, refused to conform. Napoleon decided to invade Portugal, after which made the fateful choice to march by means of Spain to do so. He claimed he would, without problems, move troops via the country. However, at the back of the scenes, he was plotting to overthrow the Spanish monarchy and position his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne. Spain, a powder keg of tradition and pleasure. Spain was a deeply ordinary, Catholic, and monarchist society. Though its Bourbon rulers had been vulnerable, the persons had been fiercely proud and deeply suspicious of international interference, certainly from innovative France. The Spanish court used to be divided between the vulnerable King Charles IV, his scheming spouse, and their ambitious son Ferdinand. Napoleon used this inner clash to control the dynasty, summoning them to Bayonne in 1808 and forcing both father and son to abdicate. He then mounted his brother Joseph as King of Spain. Napoleon had underestimated Spain gravely could too. 1808. Madrid rise. News of the Bonaparte coup infuriated the Spanish people. On May 2, a spontaneous uprising erupted in Madrid. Civilians armed with knives, stones, farming instruments attacked French soldiers. The Dos de Mayo uprising, although quickly overwhelmed, marked the starting of a nationwide uprising. French troops retaliated with brutal repression. In scenes immortalized through Francisco Goya in his haunting painting The 0.33 of May 1808, hundreds and hundreds have been completed in the streets. The French anticipated submission. What they obtained was a national warfare of resistance in contrast to anything Napoleon had ever faced. The Spanish ulcer, guerrilla conflict, and countrywide uprising. The resistance in Spain didn't comply with the foundations of Napoleonic struggle. There have been no formal battles, no fields of honor. Rather, bands of guerrilleros, regular fighters drawn from peasants, clergy, and former soldiers, started out a savage campaign of ambushes, assassinations, sabotage, and terror. They attacked supplies, trains, and messengers, murdered French collaborators, disappeared into the mountains after each and every strike. In response, French forces retaliated with mass executions, village burnings, and collective punishment. The warfare grew to become a nightmare of attrition and revenge. The time period guerrilla, that means little war, entered the global lexicon from this conflict. Britain enters the fray. The appearance of Wellington. Napoleon's economic conflict had pushed Britain into action. Seeing an opportunity to bother the French, they landed an expeditionary force in Portugal below normal. Arthur Wellesley, later referred to as the Duke of Wellington. Key events: Combat of Vimeiro 1808. Wellesley defeated the French, forcing them to withdraw from Portugal. Conference of Sintra allowed French evacuation, sparking outrage in Britain, however kept the British foothold in Iberia. Wellesley back and began an extended crusade of using the French out of Spain. Wellington used to be methodical, cautious, and effective, the antithesis of Napoleon's lightning war, and exactly what the clash required. Napoleon intervenes, in my view, 1808-1809, enraged through the incompetence of his marshals. Napoleon, in my view, led a large army of 200,000 guys into Spain in late 1808. He speedily smashed Spanish armies at Burgasomos-Iriedred, December 1808. He had recaptured Madrid and restored Manajor, so it gave the impression. But as he moved north to pursue the British, guerrilla warfare flared up again at the back of him. Wellington withdrew to Portugal, conducting a wonderful retreat and preserving the traces of Torres Vedras, an impregnable protective network that Napoleon, on no account, breached by way of early 1809, with Austria threatening warfare again in important Europe. Napoleon back to Paris, leaving Spain within the hands of his marshals. It was a grave mistake. Marshals in the mire. The incompetence of French commanders. Napoleon's lieutenants were perfect at executing his plans. However, in Spain, they operated without clear coordination and faced an enemy that refused to play through the principles. Main French marshals in Spain: Jean de Dieu Soult, bold however overambitious; André Messina, sluggish and worn down; Joachim Murat, flamboyant but cruel; Nicolas June de Dieu, tactically skilled but inflexible. These guys clashed over jurisdiction, did not coordinate simply, and had been always stressed through guerrilla attacks. Their lack of ability to subdue Spain weakened French prestige throughout Europe. The horror of the struggle. A nation in soreness. The Peninsular War used to be one of the brutal conflicts of the Napoleonic era. Civilians were massacred indiscriminately. Cities like Zaragoza and Girona have been diminished to rubble. Ailment, starvation, and rape grew too. Be fashionable. Goya's sequence of etchings, The Disasters of Warfare, provides a haunting report of the atrocities dedicated by means of all sides. This was no longer the romanticized battle of glory and banners. It was a descent into barbarity, a conflict without mercy, resistance and resilience. Spain refuses to fall regardless of occupying main cities. The French by no means truly controlled Spain. Each province had its hunter nearby resistance. Governments, church buildings, harbored rebels. Civilians handed intelligence to guerrillas. Females and kids fought and died beside men. Napoleon, for all his navy genius, might not fully grasp that conquering land was not the equal as conquering a people. Turning the tide. Wellington advances. B. means of 1812. With Napoleon distracted by his preparations to invade Russia, Wellington went on the offensive. Combat of Salamanca, July 1812. A decisive victory for the British. French forces commenced taking flight from Vital, Spain. Wellington entered Madrid later that year. By using 1813, the French had been pushed into retreat. The final blow got here on the Battle of Vittoria, June 1813, where Wellington decisively defeated Joseph Bonaparte and compelled the French to flee Spain. The crusade ended with over 300,000 French casualties over the course of the struggle. Massive charges in treasure, morale, and legitimacy, a deeply damaged popularity for Napoleon in Europe. The strategic penalties of the Peninsula. Battle 1, a drain on resources. Napoleon used to be pressured to commit over 300,000 troops to Iberia, many of them his pleasant veterans, the course of a time when he needed them in different places. 2. The myth shattered. The French military, as soon as viewed invincible, was once now repeatedly defeated with the aid of irregular fighters and a cautious British normal. 3. Idea for rebellion. The Spanish resistance influenced nationalist actions across Europe, chiefly in Germany and Italy. 4. Britain's resurgence. The Peninsular warfare allowed Britain to set up a land front, sooner or later attractive Napoleon immediately, and proving they might suit and beat him. Conclusion. A blunder that bled the empire. The Peninsular conflict began as a tactical maneuver to put into effect an exchange embargo. It ended as a catastrophic, bloody quagmire that drained the French Empire of guise, cash, and moral authority. Napoleon, blinded with the aid of hubris, had assumed the Spanish would accept his rule. Rather, they rose in fury, igniting a warfare that he might never win. Even as he would go on to conquer Moscow and lift new armies, he would not ever once more combat without the shadow of Spain behind him, a wound that never healed, an ulcer that never closed. Within the grand chessboard of Europe, few moves had been as audacious or as ruinous. Napoleon's 1812 invasion of Russia. It used to be a crusade born of pleasure, vigor, and political necessity. It will end in desolation, with the Grande Army shattered and Napoleon's aura of invincibility destroyed. The road to Moscow would end up a route of fireside, famine, and frost, and the decision to march eastward would mark the starting of the tip for the Napoleonic Empire. This chapter explores extensive the strategic missteps, huge scale, harrowing, struggling, and old consequences of the invasion of Russia, perhaps the finest navy disaster of the contemporary technology. The shattered alliance, prelude to invasion following the treaties of Tilsit in 1807. France and Russia had been on paper. Tsar Alexander I had agreed to become a member of the continental system, Napoleon's economic blockade of Britain, but the alliance was once strained from the starting. Fractures in the alliance, fiscal discontent, the continental system crippled the Russian economic climate, which depended heavily on British alternate. Napoleon's Polish ambitions, his help of the Duchy of Warsaw angered Alexander, who feared the resurrection of Poland. Dynastic insults, Napoleon's divorce from Josephine and remarriage to Marie, Louise of Austria, angered the Tsar, who had earlier supplied his sister. By means of 1810, Russia had resumed constrained exchange with Britain. Napoleon noticed this as a personal betrayal and a threat to the integrity of his empire. He commenced to organize for war. The Grandi Army, an empire mobilizesto, deliver Russia to heel. Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever. Over 600,000 guys have been mobilized from throughout the empire and its allies. French, Poles, Italians, Germans, Dutch, Swiss, Croats, Spanish and Portuguese conscripts. Logistical nightmare. Provide lines stretched over enormous quantities of kilometers. Roads have been bad. Foraging was once assumed to be the fallback. The army marched into Russia with few iciness supplies. Expecting a fast victory, Napoleon assumed that a number of swift battles would deliver the Tsar to barter. He was once fatally wrong. Crossing the Niemen, June 24, 1812. On June 24, 1812, Napoleon's forces crossed the Niemen River, officially launching the invasion of Russia. He addressed his troops, infantrymen, Russia is dragged by its fate. Its fate have to be fulfilled. The Russians, below Generals Barclay, de Tolly and Bagration, didn't provide fight. Instead, they retreated deep into Russia, enforcing a scorched earth policy, burning crops, destroying bridges, and denying Napoleon meals and shelter. The warmness was once insufferable, the dirt suffocating, and the give strains swiftly overwhelmed. Hundreds of thousands of infantrymen fell before a shot was once fired to hunger, thirst, and sickness. The march into the void as the Grande Army advanced. It left at the back of a path of death and decay. Horses died by way of the tens of hundreds of thousands. Infantrymen fell in poor health from dysentery. Entire items deserted. Still, Napoleon pressed on, hoping to force the Russians into a decisive combat. He reached Smolensk in August and captured it after heavy fighting. However, the Russian army, as soon as once more retreated in good order, leaving town in flames. Napoleon, now over 400 miles from his base, had no wintry weather quarters, no secured provide chain, and no Tsar providing surrender. But still, he pushed on to Moscow, the symbolic coronary heart of Russia. The fight of Borodino, September 7, 1812, at final. On the fields of the Russian military stood and fought. It was once the bloodiest single-day fight of the Napoleonic Wars. Over 250,000 soldiers clashed. More than 70,000 casualties in some day. Complete models annihilated. Positions taken and retaken, and forests soaked in blood. Napoleon, uncharacteristically hesitant, refused to commit his imperial shield. The combat ended with no decisive victor. However, the Russians once more retreated, and Napoleon could declare the subject. He had his victory, but it was once Pyrrhic. The burning of Moscow on September 14th. Napoleon entered Moscow best to seek out town abandoned and burning. The Russians had evacuated, and arsonists, both ordered or spontaneous, had set the city ablaze. Napoleon waited 5 weeks, hoping Alexander would negotiate. The Tsar refused. No peace overture got here. The French army languished, starving and demoralized, surrounded with the aid of ashes. Napoleon, realizing the folly, finally gave the order to retreat in mid-October. It was once too late. The retreat from Moscow, a dwelling Hellas, the Russian iciness closed in. The Grande Armée started its agonizing retreat. Temperatures plummeted under -30°C. Menos 22. If a horses died by the tens of hundreds and hundreds, squaddies froze to demise of their sleep. Cossack cavalry careworn. The retreat at every step. Frostbite and starvation claimed more men than enemy bullets. Complete regiments disintegrated. Cannibalism, desertion, and madness unfold through the ranks. Napoleon deserted the military at Smorgon in December, racing again to Paris to keep his rule. Of the original 600,000 guys, fewer than 100, zero lower back. Some historians estimate best 10,000 fight-equipped troops made it back. strategic and symbolic collapse. Napoleon's Russian crusade was a self-inflicted disaster. Penalties. The myth of Napoleonic invincibility shattered. French manipulate over Europe commenced to crumble. Prussia and Austria reconsidered their allegiance. Britain's status soared, having outlasted the greatest continental energy. Napoleon had overreached, and the whole continent sensed it. Voices from the wintry weather first-hand, bills from the retreat offer chilling insight. Guys dropped by means of the roadside like flies, black with frostbite, their cries fading into the wind. Sergeant Bergagna, we ate up horsemeat, melted snow, and leather. Some drank urine. The dead have been stripped earlier than they have been bloodless. Captain Francois, the Emperor, rode silent, gaunt, by myself. Even he understood the magnitude of what had occurred. Marshal Ney was once avoidable. Historians proceed to debate whether Napoleon might have avoided catastrophe. Will he have halted at Smolensk? Might he have authorized a limited crusade in Poland? Was Moscow ever a helpful purpose? Ultimately, his determination stemmed from a mixture of pleasure, strategic overreach, and underestimation of the Russian spirit. The same features that made him quality boldness, confidence, relentless will also led him into the abyss. Conclusion. The opening of the top. Napoleon's 1812 invasion of Russia was once greater than a military failure. It was once a psychological turning factor, both for Europe and for Napoleon himself. He returned to France a ghost of the emperor, who had once dictated the fate of international locations. The empire, as soon as expansive and apparently unshakable, now teetered. Europe had visible the emperor bleed. The wolves had been circling. Inside 2 years, they would drive him from energy. The shattered remnants of Napoleon's Grande Army, back from Russia in late 1812, a mere shadow of its former glory. The campaign had drained France's navy force and prestige, emboldening its enemies to strike with renewed vigor. From 1813 to 1814, a powerful alliance of European powers, the Sixth Coalition, consisting of Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, Spain, and others, waged a relentless campaign to dismantle the Napoleonic Empire. This chapter chronicles the desperate battles, strategic gambits, and political upheavals that culminated in Napoleon's compelled abdication and exile to Elba. Europe rises towards Napoleon. Napoleon's defeat in Russia shattered the myth of invincibility. His enemies seized the moment. Russia and Prussia pushed for warfare, rebuilding armies and making ready to march into France. Austria, led with the aid of Prince Metternich, cautiously joined the coalition after years of uneasy neutrality. Britain, already a steadfast enemy, provided dollars and troops to the coalition. Sweden, under Crown Prince Charles John, previously Marshal Bernadotte of France, joined the alliance. Collectively, these powers fashioned the Sixth Coalition, intent on ending Napoleon's dominance. The campaign of 1813. The warfare strikes too. Germany. The crusade started in the spring of 1813. Napoleon hurried to rebuild his forces, gathering roughly 300,000 soldiers, in most cases inexperienced conscripts. The combat of Lutzen, May 2, 1813. Napoleon scored a tactical victory over the mixed Russian-Prussian forces. The fight was once fierce, with heavy casualties on both sides. Regardless of victory, Napoleon failed to decisively cripple the coalition armies. The combat of Bautzen, May 20th to 21st, 1813, a further French victory, pushing coalition forces again. Nonetheless, Napoleon's inability to give a knockout blow extended the warfare. The traitors and the Allies. Austria joins the battle. Austria entered the battle formally in August 1813, tipping the balance towards Napoleon. Prince Metternich sought to revive Europe's stability of energy, but in addition to maintain Austria's impact, the Battle of Dresden, August 26th to 27th, 1813. Napoleon decisively defeated a greater coalition. Dresden was once his final first-class victory, showcasing his tactical brilliance. Nonetheless, strategic setbacks elsewhere overshadowed this success. The Battle of Leipzig, October 16th to 19th, 1813. The combat of nations. The decisive moment of the warfare came at Leipzig, near today's-day Germany. The coalition assembled a significant force of over 500,000 squaddies. Napoleon commanded roughly 190,000 troops. Exhausted and outnumbered, the fight raged for 4 days in a brutal, chaotic fight. heavy casualties on both sides, over 90,000 coalition and 70,000 French. Ultimately, the coalition's numerical superiority prevailed. Napoleon was once forced right into a retreat across the Rhine. The combat of Leipzig was once the largest combat in European historical past earlier than world conflict. Iron marked the starting of the tip for Napoleon's empire, the invasion of France. The coalition marches dwelling after Leipzig. Coalition armies crossed into French territory in early 1814. Napoleon, though severely outnumbered, waged a fierce shielding campaign in 6 battles known as the 6 Days Crusade, briefly halting the coalition in Hants. Paris falls. The final blow. Regardless of Napoleon's skillful maneuvers, the coalition steadily advanced on Paris. By March 1814, Paris was surrounded and underneath siege. Alexander I of Russia and Prince Schwarzenberg of Austria led the coalition forces. The city suffered bombardment and hunger. Napoleon attempted desperate diplomatic efforts, however, found little help amongst his possessed allies. The abdication of Napoleon in April 6, 1814. Napoleon was pressured to abdicate unconditionally. He was once granted sovereignty over the small island of Elba, off the coast of Italy. The Bourbon monarchy used to be restored in France. Under Louis XVIII, Napoleon was once allowed to keep the title emperor, but stripped of vigour. Napoleon single quotes as legacy after defeated. Napoleon's impact remained profound. His legal reforms, Napoleonic Code, endured throughout Europe. His reshaping of European borders laid groundwork for future nation-states. His legend grew, setting the stage for his dramatic return during the 100 Days. Conclusion. The fall of an empire, the War of the Sixth Coalition, uncovered the boundaries of Napoleon's genius. Regardless of tactical brilliance, he used to be overwhelmed via coordinated worldwide resistance and inside weaknesses. His first fall from power used to be a shock too. Europe, nevertheless, it was once, now not the top of the story. Napoleon's abdication in April 1814 marked a seeming finish to an era. Yet, within lower than 12 months, the exiled emperor would stage one of the vital dramatic comebacks in history, strolling back from Elba, rallying France, and difficult to complete European order all over again. His last campaign would culminate in the fight of Waterloo, second that would seal his destiny eternally. This chapter explores the anxiety, hope, despair, and ultimate conflict of Napoleon's 100 Days, from his daring breakout to his ultimate defeat and exile. Elba, a king in exile after his abdication. Napoleon was once exiled to the small Mediterranean island of Elba, granted sovereignty over the island, maintained a small personal shield and courtroom. Regardless of decreased energy, he actively ruled and deliberate. However, lifestyles on Elba was once confining for a man conversant in ruling an empire. Europe's fragile. Peace again in France and Europe. The Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVIII was once restored. Many French residents were dissatisfied with the restored monarchy. European powers convened at the Congress of Vienna, aiming to redraw the continent's map and secure long-time period peace. But the continent remained unstable. The escape and the march to Paris. February 26, 1815. Napoleon escaped Elba with a small fleet, touchdown on the French mainland at on March 1st, marched north toward Paris with fewer than 1,000 guys. As he developed, Napoleon's charisma and legend stimulated countless numbers of infantrymen and citizens to rally to his cause. The flight of the royalists, the Bourbon regime crumbled. Troops dispatched to arrest Napoleon instead joined him. Louis XVIII fled Paris. On March 20, 1815, Napoleon triumphantly entered Paris, reclaiming power without bloodshed. The 100 Days had begun. Europe mobilizes once more. The information sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia quickly shaped the Seventh Coalition to oppose Napoleon. Armies mobilized along France's borders. Napoleon ready for warfare, determined to safeguard his restored throne. The Crusade of 1815, prelude to Waterloo. Napoleon confronted a coalition army greater than his own, dispersed throughout Belgium and northern France. His technique was once daring: strike the coalition forces individually earlier than they could unite. The battles of Ligny and Quatre Bras, June 16, 1815. Napoleon struck first at Ligny, defeating the Prussians under Subject Marshal Blucher. Quatre Bras where Marshal Ney fought the British-led coalition. Despite victories and heavy fighting, Napoleon failed to ruin the Prussian navy absolutely. The Battle of Waterloo, June 18, 1815. The decisive fight was once fought near the village of Waterloo, Belgium. Opposing forces: Napoleon's military, approximately 73,000 soldiers; Allied forces underneath Duke of Wellington, approximately 68,000 British, Dutch, Belgian and German troops; Prussian reinforcements beneath Blucher. When fight. Overview. The day was marked with the aid of heavy rain, muddy terrain, and fierce combat. French attacks on Wellington's shielding positions met stubborn resistance. Late within the day, Prussian forces arrived, tipping the stability. The French imperial shield, Napoleon's elite troops, made a final determined assault only to be repelled by using night. The French navy collapsed and retreated in sickness. Aftermath. The tip of the Emperor. Waterloo was once a crushing defeat. Casualties surpassed 40,000 combined. Napoleon fled to Paris, the place he was pressured to abdicate, again on June 22, 1815, surrendered to the British, and was once exiled to the far-off island of St. Helena, within the South Atlantic. Legacy of the 100 Days. Napoleon's last act used to be marked through his unmatched capability to inspire loyalty and command, tactical brilliance, but strategic overreach, the resilience of European coalition forces. Waterloo ended an ethnology of close consistent conflict and reshaped Europe for decades. Conclusion. Genius, tyrant, or tragic, determine. The 100 Days encapsulate the contradictions of Napoleon, a man of ambition, charisma, and military genius, but additionally one whose relentless pursuit of vigor brought loss of life and devastation. His ultimate defeat at Waterloo used to be as a lot a testament to his limits as to his greatness. After his crushing defeat at Waterloo in June 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte's top-notch ride ended in exile away from the courts and battlefields of Europe. The far-flung island of St. Helena, located 1,000s of miles within the South Atlantic Ocean, became the surroundings of his ultimate years. A sluggish, lonely decline watched closely through the sector he once ruled. This chapter explores Napoleon's lifestyles in captivity, his reflections and writings, the controversies surrounding his dying, and the profound legacy that formed present-day, historical past. The trip to St. Helena following his give-up to the British aboard the ship Bellerophon. Napoleon was once transported to St. Helena, arriving in October 1815. The island used to be a barren, volcanic outcrop, isolated and inhospitable. British authorities took best pains to preclude any risk of escape or rescue. Napoleon was limited to Longwood Condominium, a damp, windswept estate poorly acceptable to the previous emperor's well-being. Lifestyles in captivity. Napoleon's captivity used to be marked through strict surveillance by means of British officials and squaddies, a small however loyal entourage, together with generals, servants, and his private surgeon. Intellectual objectives: reading, writing memoirs, and dictating his recollections. Despite confinement, Napoleon maintained his dignity and composure, though his health step by step deteriorated. Reflections and memoirs on the course of exile. Napoleon dictated extensive memoirs and letters. Delivering his perspective on his reign, he portrayed himself as a defender of the revolution, looking for order and reform. He blamed his screw-ups on betrayal through allies, treachery, and overwhelming opposition. His writings have been geared toward preserving his legacy and justifying his moves. These memoirs have come to be fundamental ancient files, supplying insight into his mind and motivations. Health decline and diet. Napoleon's well-being worsened over time. He suffered from continual belly suffering and weak point. The targeted intent of his loss of life on June 5, 1821, stays debated. Officially, stomach cancer. Some theories advocate arsenic poisoning or different factors. His loss of life marked the end of an individual existence, but now not the top of his impact. The return of the stays. The Retour des 1840, beneath King Louis-Philippe. Napoleon's stays were returned to France in a grand ceremony, buried in Les Invalides, Paris. His tomb became an emblem of French nationalism and complex memory. The Napoleon legend, hero or tyrant. Napoleon's legacy is contested and multifaceted. As a genius army, innovator and strategist, reformer of law and administration, modernizor of education and infrastructure, as a tyrant, ruthless dictator, warmonger, causing millions of deaths, suppressor of liberty and nationalist movements, have an impact on Europe, and the sector Napoleon's have an effect on resonates to this present day. The Napoleonic Code laid foundations for modern-day legal programs. Global that his reshaping of Europe's political map influenced nationalism and the rise of brand-new states. Army methods studied and emulated for generations. A symbol of ambition, management, and the risks of absolute power. Historical interpretations over time. Historians have debated whether or not Napoleon was once the product or destroyer of the revolution. The steadiness between his achievements and his hubris. Easy methods to reconcile the man of the people with the emperor of conquest. Conclusion. The tip of an acknowledging Napoleon's exile and dying closed a dramatic chapter in history. He was once a person who rose from obscurity to rule Europe, whose goals reshaped international locations, and whose ambitions unleashed remarkable cliché, but his difficult legacy stays a source of fascination, debate, and proposal, a testament to the skinny line between genius and tyranny. Napoleon Bonaparte's lifestyles and career evoke one of the most passionate and conflicting opinions in all discourse. Was he a visionary genius who shaped ultramodern Europe and championed progressive beliefs? Or was once he a ruthless tyrant whose ambitions precipitated preferred suffering and destabilized the continent? This ultimate chapter takes a comprehensive peer at Napoleon's multifaceted legacy, analyzing how historians, contemporaries, and societies have grappled along with his exotic affect, assessing both his towering achievements and devastating penalties. The genius, architect of brand new Europe. Napoleon's brilliance as a navy commander is undisputed. Army innovation. He revolutionized struggle with speedy troop movements, corps procedure organization, and combined hands procedures, influencing navy doctrine. Globally authorized reforms. The Napoleonic Code, based in 1804, codified civil legislation, guaranteeing property rights, equality before the law, and secular authorized frameworks. Its affect extends to many international locations today. Administrative modernization. He centralized executive, created effective paperwork, reformed tax systems, and standardized education with the lycée process. Promotion of meritocracy. Despite the fact that an emperor, Napoleon promoted ability and fulfillment over birthright, opening possibilities for social mobility. Unfold of progressive beliefs. Though he crowned himself emperor, a lot of his reforms embodied the Enlightenment principles of liberty, equality, and secular governance. His transformative position helped dismantle feudal structures and accelerated the modernization of Europe. The tyrant, the expenditures of ambition. Napoleon's reign introduced general struggle and loss of life. The Napoleonic Wars caused millions of deaths and popular devastation across Europe. Authoritarian rule. He curtailed press freedoms, censored dissent, and used a secret police to manage imperial ambitions. His installation of loved ones, individuals, on thrones, and aggressive enlargement destabilized centered monarchies and sparked nationalist resistance. Suppression of nationalism. While promoting some liberal suggestions, Napoleon crushed nationalist uprisings after they threatened his empire. Economic disruption. The continental procedure geared toward Britain disrupted alternate, harming economies across the continent. His ambition arguably plunged Europe into close, steady clash for over a decade. Napoleon, by way of trendy ice throughout his lifetime and immediately after, opinions different generally. Supporters saw him as a hero who rose from the revolution to carry order and glory. Opponents branded him a dictator and warmonger. The French men and women were divided, admiring his reforms but weary of unending conflict. Napoleon's enduring symbolism. Napoleon grew to be a symbol of energy and ambition. Nationalism. In France, he remains a figure of pride and countrywide identity. Army legend. Armies worldwide betrayed his campaigns. Cultural influence. He appears in literature, artwork, and film as each hero and villain. His "Identify by Myself" evokes grand ambition and dramatic rise and fall. Ancient debates, genius or tyrant. Historians proceed to debate. Did Napoleon shop the French Revolution or betray it? Was once his authoritarianism justified by using the need for order? Could his empire have persisted had he made one-of-a-kind alternatives? These questions stay open, reflecting the complexity of his legacy. The paradox of Napoleon. Napoleon embodies contradiction. A person who championed liberty but dominated as a dictator, a military genius who sought peace through war, a reformer who created a centralized empire, had determined both, celebrated and reviled. His life is a study in the balance of power and principle. Conclusion. An immortal legacy. Napoleon's story is more than history. It's a lesson on leadership, ambition, and end result. His unique rise and fall illustrate the heights to which human genius can ascend, and the dangers when power becomes unchecked. Subsequently, Napoleon remains an immortal determine, a genius, and a tyrant whose effect reshaped the arena and whose story continues to captivate.